Our session on inequality. I'm the chair of this session. My name is Shumon Shet. I'm from the University of Oxford. First of all, may I request you all to come as close as possible and sitting together, because we only have, when you have a question, we only have a mic that we have to, distribute around to have your question. So if you all can come forward and sit together in the first few rows, that will be very helpful for us. So we have 4 presentations in this session. The first one by Andreas Georgiadis from University of Oxford. The second one is from Dr. Abebe Simales. The third one from Andreas Kostadam, and the fourth one will be by myself. So we all will have, each of us will have 30 minutes for presentations, discussions, and question answers. So without further delay, we start with Andreas Georgiadis. Andreas, welcome.
Thanks. Let me check that. Yeah, it's working. Okay. Right. So my talk, given the time limitation, I'm going to give you a very basic story. And actually, that's the only story I have in my mind right now, because I just finished the paper 2 days ago. So the paper asks 2 basic questions. And the first question is that what is the association of a different range of parental background, characteristics, or outcomes, or skills on child development or human capital indicators across different contexts, like different countries, and across at different ages of the child's, life cycle. The second question that I'm asking in the paper, or I try to address in the paper, is that how do these associations of different parental background dimensions and child's human capital evolve as the child ages? So why this is important? This is, of course, important to understand the intergenerational transmission of poverty and inequality over the life cycle and across contexts. So what are the main gaps in the literature? Well, what's new about this paper? First of all, there is, as far as developing countries is concerned, there is, a vast number of studies trying to actually document association of socioeconomic status of parents as measured by education or income or sometimes occupation with child outcomes. Mainly for developing countries is health outcomes, but recently there is a literature looking also on cognitive skills. So the vast majority of studies have actually been concerned with socioeconomic status on the parental side and mostly health on the child side. So there is not much work on what is the association between another, if you like, set of background dimensions, like, for example, parental health, parental cognitive or non-cognitive skills, on child's human capital as measured by child's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So this is one gap. The second gap is that the vast majority of empirical studies trying to document associations between parents' characteristics and children's outcomes, they isolate, they focus on one particular parental factor. And the standard example is socioeconomic status. They look at maternal education on child outcomes in isolation. And of course, this makes it very uncertain how to interpret the association, because of course we know that there are so many other dimensions of the mother or the father that are not taken into account, and they may be associated with education or income. We know that parents with higher income may be more educated, may be more healthy, may have better psychosocial skills, etc. The third is that there is, as far as the developing world is concerned, there is no evidence on how the association between parental background and child outcomes evolve as the child ages over the life cycle of the child. So there is no evidence on that, and that's the 3 gaps that the paper tries to address. So what I'm doing is that, to address these gaps, is I'm using data from the Young Lives cohort study, which follows children in 4 countries, Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam. And I consider simultaneously the association of a wide range of parental background dimensions with measures of child's human capital at different ages of the child's life course. So, the major findings are as follows, if I can summarize them. First of all, I do find that parental income is a very important predictor of child's cognitive skills and child's anthropometry, like as measured by height for age, at all stages of childhood and across all countries. So income matters. But I find that parental education, once one takes into account a wide range of other dimensions, has a weak or no association with human capital measures. I do find also, which says something like, I think that this is a new finding in the literature, that mother's personality traits are much more important for child's non-cognitive skills. And I will show you how I actually measure mother personality traits. One measure is mother's non-cognitive skills, another measure is mother's aspirations about the child's education, another measure is a mother's prosociality. Finally, when I looked at the patterns of the associations as the child ages, that means across the different stages of the life cycle of the child, I do not find systematic pattern in the magnitude of association. That means that I do not find that the association increases over the age of the child or decreases systematically. The only pattern that I find systematically is that the association between mother's aspirations for child's education with child's cognitive and non-cognitive skills is indeed increasing with children's age. That means that it's by far higher for older children. So this suggests something about cumulative effects. So this is a very simple mechanistic kind of structural graph to show how different parental background markers or characteristics may affect a child's human capital. Based on standard economic theory, there are three kinds of channels. The one is parental preferences, the other parental budget, and the third one is parental productivity. So the point I try to make here is that parents with different characteristics, like different education, income, psychosocial competence, etc., have different preferences that may affect over child's investing in child's human capital. They have, of course, different budgetary constraints and limitations, and they have different productivity in combining inputs to produce child's human capital. Now, as far as the kind of theory or mechanism that could explain how the association can evolve with the child's age, I mean, at different stages of the child's life, there are two kinds of hypotheses. The one is supported by the standard Cunha and Heckman technology of human capital formation over the life course model, which suggests that there is self-productivity and dynamic complementarity in the production technology of child's human capital. So according to this is that, skill begets skill. And that means that the higher is the earlier period skill for an individual, the more likely that future investment will pay off. And also this actually affects directly the future human capital level. In a sense that lagged or prior level of human capital is a direct input on the next period's human capital, and also affects positively the productivity of investment for the next period. If this is the case, we expect that the effect of parental background, given that it's positive with initial stages of human capital, this will accumulate over time. So we will expect an increasing pattern of the association between parental background and child's human capital measures. Another kind of hypothesis formulated in the child development literature suggests that as the child grows, the home environment and parental influence become less important, because there are other environments that matter more and more, like school environment or interaction with peers. So these are two, hypotheses that make different kind of predictions of how the magnitude of association could actually evolve over the child's lifetime. So in order to actually explore these associations and the patterns in the data, I use data from the Young Lives cohort study that actually, the Young Lives has three waves of data. The one collected 2002, 2006, and 2009. I'm focusing on 2006 and 2009. So Young Lives collects data on these three waves on two cohorts, one born in 1994 and one born in 2002. So in 2006 and 2009, where actually that are my years that I'm focusing on the analysis, these children were 5, 12, 8, and 15 years old. In a sense that the younger cohort in the Young Life Study data were 5 and 8 in 2006 and 2009 respectively, and the older cohort were 12 and 15. So what are the outcomes? The child outcomes that I'm looking across countries and over different age groups is the child's height for age Z-score, which is an indicator of chronic malnutrition, and it's supposed to be an important developmental indicator for children. I look at the children's Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, or elsewhere known PPVT, which is a measure of receptive vocabulary and supposed actually to approximate quite well verbal cognitive achievement. And I construct my own children's non-cognitive skills index that combines, is a composite of different items trying to gauge child's personality traits like self-esteem and self-efficacy. So these are the three outcomes that I actually gauge as indicators of child's human capital. As far as the independent variables that I actually put in the right-hand side of the regressions I run, these include some basic child characteristics like age and birth order, and then the parental background dimensions which I want to focus on. There are some standard mother's demographics like age, ethnicity, caste, etc. I include household wealth as a measure of income, mother's and father's educations, mother's height as a measure of mother's health, mother's non-cognitive skills index, which is a kind of similar composite as the child's non-cognitive skills index. So mother's subjective well-being, trying to actually measure mother's life satisfaction from 1 to 9. Mother's bargaining power, which is again a composite of the extent a mother within the household controls different range of resources in the household. Mother's social capital, that again is a composite of different items combining together the membership of the mother in certain associations, informal groups or networks in the community, as well as mother's level of generalized trust and trust over public services. These are actually measures of a person's prosociality and are supposed to be part of an individual social capital. Now, finally, we have a measure in the data of mother's aspirations for child's future education. So there is an explicit question asked to the mother, how many years of education would you like your child to actually complete in the future? So I also include some community characteristics like, controls like region of the community and whether the community is urban or rural. So, I mean, there are many regressions across different ages and different countries. So what I'm going to focus on is on the indicators that I have, the many stars. So I will focus on these stars here that say that the wealth index is positively associated throughout ages and countries, and here 12. So you find that systematically you have a positive association with wealth index. So you have this systematic across ages and across countries. The other, of course, case where I have this systematic association is with mother's height. You would expect that mother's height biologically or genetically would actually correlate very strongly with the child's height for age. This is the height for age kind of regression. As far as education is concerned, I do find some associations some of the times, but not always significant, and sometimes it's and when I find it significant, it's quite small. The same with father's association. I mean, as far as the other kind of dimensions is concerned, there are some cases in some countries or some ages that I find some significance or some association, but it's not systematic. So what I would keep from these regressions is that the systematic relationship with income, the less weak association with mother's or father's education, and of course the strong association with mother's height, which is intergenerational transmission of health. This is the PPVT this is the cognitive skills indicator regressions. Again, I find this systematic relationship with wealth index very strong and across countries and ages. Another kind of systematic relationship with education seems to be important, but not in all cases and all countries. But where my focus would be on this is the mother's aspirations, where it starts to be quite significantly associated for some countries, but then it grows in magnitude across ages. As you can see, it becomes larger and larger as the child ages, and it's systematically and more strongly and across countries. So what I will keep actually as a message from these regressions, and I will show you this graph, is that I find that the mother's aspiration for child education seems to be much more important in terms of association or strength compared to mother's education. And it actually seems that the association grows over time across all countries. So it becomes more important as the children age. Now, finally, this is my regression for child non-cognitive skills. I find some systematic association with wealth, but compared to the other outcomes, this association seems relatively weaker. So what I wanted to focus, education actually doesn't seem to be that strong in this kind of regressions. But what is quite strong is, first of all, mother's non-cognitive skills, which suggest an intergenerational transmission of non-cognitive skills. And this is actually systematic across, it's quite strong and systematic across ages and across countries. Another thing that is very actually strong, significantly, positively and systematically associated is mother social capital. Again, this is actually quite large effects and systematic across countries, but I don't find any particular pattern over the age of the child. Finally, I would actually emphasize also the association with mother's aspiration for child education, which it's quite actually significant in many cases, and again, it seems like to grow with age. So again, I would like to show these increasing patterns over the child's age with the mother's aspirations for child's education. So if I could summarize, is that for the child's height for age, I do find a significant and positive association with wealth or income, even when I control for a range of parental characteristics. So income still remains important. Mother's height, of course, which suggests this intergenerational transmission of health, and I find some significance with parental education, but it's weaker than income or other kind of, or mother's height. I don't find a systematic pattern of increasing magnitude of association or decreasing over the child's life course in the case of height for age. In the case of cognitive skills, I do find that, again, income is important. It actually has a strong positive association. Parental education is significant, but is less important than income, and that mother's aspirations for the child's education are actually very strongly and increasingly associated with cognitive skills of the child as the child ages. And maybe the associations on average on mother's aspirations are larger in magnitude than the mother's education. Finally, for non-cognitive skills, I find that mother's non-cognitive skills is the most important predictor rather than income in this case. Social capital is also more important than income, and that mother's aspirations for the child education are also strongly associated, and the association actually grows as the child ages. Parental education plays a role, but is not systematic and is not that strong. So as far as the patterns over the child's life cycle is concerned, the only systematic pattern I find is that the association between mother's aspirations for the child's education and child's cognitive and non-cognitive skills grows as with children's age. So I think, am I done, or do I have one more minute?
I think that is almost there.
Okay, so I'm done. I don't have to summarize anything. Or maybe I put it back.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Indeed, an interesting piece of work. So the main findings of the paper: parental socioeconomic situations is positively associated with all three child outcomes, whereas parental education has not been positively associated with non-cognitive outcome. Mother's non-cognitive outcome affects that of children's strongly. So first question, there are a few questions that I would like to ask, and then I would definitely leave the discussion to the audience. The first one is how and what kind of interventions would your work provide? You know, because in most of the countries, they're developing countries, and one of the objectives is to reduce child poverty at the early age. So if you can talk about some of the interventions and what kind of policies and where it can go. Question 2, did you control for the number of children in the household, which is another concern for quality versus quantity? If you have more number of children, larger number of children, it's difficult to pay attention separately to each of them. Not sure from your paper if you have done so. Another interesting question I had in mind when I was looking at the results on India. Parental background, caste actually plays a huge role, in driving child poverty. So if it is possible to look at these different background characteristics. The fourth one, I see, and I agree that you have looked at each of the three dimensions separately. And where I was also thinking, because probably I come from a multidimensional study background, whether it is possible also to understand the joint failures in these three dimensions and sort of run ordered probit sort of regression to understand how it is going. And finally, do you have any income variable or wealth index includes income? If not, income fluctuates more actually than wealth. So if you can say something about it. So I stop here. You may choose to answer the questions or save for later, and we have more questions. How would you like to do?
Do I use a microphone here or shall I stand?
Yeah, let's use it. Sorry.
It's all right. Thank you for the questions. So the first one was how and what kind of interventions does that suggest? I mean, it's a descriptive work, and I cannot draw prescriptions, but I can say that this is evidence suggesting something, if I want to be accurate. So my kind of focus would be on the child's non-cognitive skills. At the end of the day, the vast majority of policies seem to focus on mother's socioeconomic status or parents' socioeconomic status. So the World Bank or other kind of institutions, or even in the MDGs, they emphasize this mother's education is so important. I don't deny that it's not important, but what I was trying to actually suggest here is that maybe this strong association may actually hide some other kind of dimensions. So what I find is the case, as I showed you in the patterns, in the case of child non-cognitive skills, which are extremely important in predicting an individual's wages and socioeconomic status in the future, mother's personality traits, as I call, like the non-cognitive skills of the mother, like self-efficacy or self-esteem of the mother, and prosociality of the mother, and of course mother's aspiration seems to be much more important, or at least not much more important than mother's education, and in some cases more important than income. So at the end of the day, what this would suggest is that there are parenting kind of interventions across developing countries. Some parenting interventions have been actually emphasizing maternal education or maternal cognitive skills. So what you could take away is that maybe, I cannot imagine how you designed a particular policy, but boosting the mother's, in this particular case, self-efficacy, self-esteem, or if you like, promoting her aspirations over her child's future, that would be a kind of policy that would be reflected from this kind of findings. Now, as far as caste, I have to say that I did mention it briefly. I have included all these characteristics like ethnicity and caste in all my regressions, but I didn't present them in the tables because that would make results even more confusing. But yes, you are absolutely right. Caste seems to be extremely important in India, as also I find that mother's age is also very important across all countries. But I didn't actually focus on these results because I consider them as controls mainly and not as predictors in my kind of analysis. But I could discuss maybe in the paper the roles of these kind of characteristics. Now, as far as the multidimensional approach is concerned, I'm very sympathetic with the approach, but what I know as far as your approach is concerned is that you work like an accordion, so you actually compose and decompose your indices. You don't? So I thought that once you get a relationship between a multidimensional kind of measure with an outcome, then you actually decompose it to see what drives this association. So I have to say that I just go directly to the decomposed kind of approach in this case. But yes, I could explore that, definitely, to put them together and come up with a multidimensional measure. Now, as far as income variable is concerned, we normally use the wealth index. An alternative kind of measure you can use is consumption expenditure. But what I find in my work is that we also have some data on income. But what the literature suggests and what I find systematically in my work is that these are consumption, expenditure, and income are much more noisy measures than with the wealth index. And the wealth index includes some proxies of income like consumer durables, as well as services, etc. But services is mainly based on infrastructure, but consumer durables make up to some part of the long-run income. Thanks.
Well, I now leave the question and answer session to the audience. Questions?
Okay, thank you very much. So my general impression is it's a very good work. I think the topic is also very interesting. I have two concerns. One is, I think it's very important to provide some association, but I think it's much more important to try to go beyond those associations. For example, if you come up with some relationships, I think it might be very informative to tell us, for example, how differences between cultures or maybe some social backgrounds from one country to another might explain the associations we have. So I think that would be that should be the next step, of your work. And I also find very interesting that you bring the birth order, because there is a theory, I think, which you develop in psychology, I think, which is called the birth order theory. So my question is, how the result you got in your work might draw from the theory which you develop outside?
Would you like to take one more question and then get back?
I can take another one, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Very, very interesting things. I want to start with reiterating a point, like where do you see, or which ones are you going to select to look at causality? Because that is indeed the next step. And it's probably too much to do it all, but which ones are your favorites and have you thought about in kind of contributing? And then the second one is, I like very much the setup at the beginning. And because I like it, I'm going to think critically about it. So the two hypotheses, I'm not sure whether they're really exclusive. If you think really in a Heckman framework, I mean, the accepted wisdom now is that nature, nurture do not exclude themselves. So maybe in extremis you're right, that the hypotheses exclude each other, but on average probably not. And your parental background predicts the potential, but whether the potential expresses itself depends on the environment. And as a parent, you don't have control, for instance, of the kids, of the friends that your kid has, which may have in at certain ages a tremendous effect. So I think it's very interesting, but I'm just thinking myself how to push that forward, because I don't think it's as dichotomous.
You have 2 minutes
to
answer this question.
First of all, shall I take the first questions? I mean, of course, normally what I do is that I try to deal with questions efficiently. Efficiently means that deal with one question in one paper. So, I have descriptive work, but I also have kind of more structural causal work. That I think, which means that, if you do descriptives, you can actually treat a range of different factors symmetrically. But when you don't do description, you want to do causal analysis, you have to focus on one. So my purpose here is to descriptive analysis is partly trying to address causality issues. Of course, it doesn't do it comprehensively, but what it says that if I only have one dimension, there are omitted variables. What if I include a set of control for a set of characteristics that may actually abate the omitted variable bias? Of course, it doesn't actually, I don't eliminate it, but it actually makes it less big. You're absolutely right. There was no time to discuss difference across context, but that was absolutely my purpose in the paper, to try to discuss the difference across context in the associations. As far as the birth order is concerned, I will have to actually look at the theory you suggested, which is outside economics, because I do find significant association with birth order and all these outcomes across countries. So I think, Peter, I actually addressed your question about causality. I do agree about your comment. So what I was trying to suggest is that there are two conflicting hypotheses here. The one suggesting upward kind of, increasing trend in associations, and the other actually decreasing. but they may operate at the same time. I didn't actually suggest that they are exclusive. So what I would say, I wanted to actually emphasize that if I find a clear increasing pattern, then maybe this is evidence of the Heckman mechanism going on, or actually the Heckman mechanism dominating the kind of paradigm that other environment, parental background diminishes in importance and other factors come in. So that was the only kind of intention, but I never actually meant that these were exclusive, but it was a very good point, I agree.
Thank you so much. We have the second presentation by Abebe Shimales on the making of middle class in Africa. Which one? This is one, right? Yeah. There you go.
Yeah,
can
thank
use
you.
this one.
Sure. Well, this is a light paper, very descriptive, which tries to look at the making of, we call it the middle class in Africa. Some of you might really wonder what inspired this work. Why talk about middle class in Africa at this point in time? Obviously, I work for the African Development Bank, so a couple of years ago, there was informal discussion among some experts in the area of poverty and inequality who suggested that there is no middle class in Africa for various reasons, some of which we all know. But then there is emerging literature that says middle class is an important social group with a tendency of hopefully driving stability, social and economic reforms, etc. And being in Tunis, for us also, we were able to see in action the middle class. And even now, during this transition, we are able to see the elements embodying the middle class playing a major role in transforming the countries. So there is some consensus that the larger the middle class you have in a society, the better it is. So with this, we started to ask some questions like, if there is a middle class in Africa, what is the size? Who are these people? And what are their individual characteristics? And of course, what makes people to move within the classes, from being poor to middle class to upper middle class, and vice versa. So in a way, it's a bit ambitious, but also tries to provide some answers to these questions. Particularly, our interest is to look at that, everyone who knows Africa, the common sense thing to ask is, okay, if you really want to increase your size of middle class, probably the focus on institutions that allow the nurturing of such a middle class to emerge, and also to focus on equal opportunities like education and health. That come as a natural pathways towards achieving these goals. So we focus on these two dimensions. But as all of you here know, working on Africa is a very daunting task, the data issue, etc. So in this presentation, you will see some of the struggles we have done to make sense of out of the existing data. The first question is, of course, how do you identify the middle class? Who are they? So there is already a rich literature, and of course there is a debate about who belongs in that group. So I don't think I need to spend much time on this, because any definition has some element of arbitrariness, and in howsoever you try to convince people, there is always some sense of arbitrariness. So in this study, we have used asset as a major indicator of welfare, and the demographic and health surveys that are available for Africa as a source of our data set. Therefore, we constructed an asset index, which everybody does these days, and then use this to measure the size of the middle class. But we try to use a little bit of also innovation here. Why not stack all the micro data available on the DHS into one data file? So we created about 750,000 observations, but then with a lot of right-hand side variables, and see, how crazy outcomes can you find, or is there a story out of this? So probably that is a bit of what is interesting here. The other is we created also a synthetic panel out of it, so that we'll be able to see movements in and out of the middle class over time, but also to look at the characteristics driving the size of the middle class. So I will skip a few of these very well-known ways of doing it. The multiple correspondence analysis that is close to the factor analysis, which is suitable to the data that we have. So I will just try to focus on the results. So we can come back to the methods when my discussant starts to shoot the gun. So I will just focus on the main results. What's the takeaway anyway from this analysis? So one is, of course, the average size of the middle class, howsoever you measure it, somehow in Africa has been rising during the last few decades, especially the 90s and 2000, when you compare the two periods. And then we try to compare it with an earlier study, again I did, using consumption expenditure as an underlying welfare indicator. And the correlation is quite strong. Here, this is the lowest fit for the trends in the size of the middle class over the years, which is self-evident here. And I try to compare it with the Gini coefficient for the asset index. The pattern is not so much clear, as you can see. However, there is a tendency that the asset inequality affects the middle class size. This is a correlation between consumption-based measure of middle class and the asset-based middle class for selected African countries for which we have much data. And I think there is a fair consistency between the two. Now, when you look at some of the key results, the size of the middle class in most of African countries has increased. These are about 26 countries for which we had multiple data sets over time. The paper, the full paper, which is already available, you can look at the annex where we have listed all the countries with the size of the middle class. So some of the star performers are like Senegal, Kenya, Ghana, Namibia, Nigeria, Morocco, etc. But in some cases, the fall in the size of the middle class in and of itself is not a bad thing. I'll just show you something. The fact that the size of the middle class is shrinking for the measure you are using may not necessarily come from because bad things are happening. This is the case of Egypt, for instance. Egypt, between 2003 and 2008, when you just look at the entire distribution, it has shifted to the right. So the size of the middle class has declined, but the average asset index has increased. Inequality also has decreased. So, I was initially puzzled. Why would this, what would you tell to people? Look, because you are doing well, your size of the middle class is shrinking, and does it make sense? Then I went back to read a few about this debate in the US, the shrinking middle class, that started since the 80s as a means of election. Even today, everyone talks about the middle class there. What they found was actually because life started to get better, and when the measure of the welfare measure is held constant, everybody now has, electricity in their house. Everybody has now probably tap water. If you fix that measure and the distribution shifts to the right, the size of the middle class may shrink. We can talk about this later on. Another example is the Ghana one, where middle class size increased for two reasons. Asset accumulation has increased, but also asset inequality has decreased. So this is a normal path you would expect. So Ghana is another good example. Madagascar is a worst example where the asset index has declined. On the average, everyone was not doing well, but also inequality has increased. So these are just illustrations in the mechanics of the size of the middle class, how you can interpret them. In the case of poverty, it's very straightforward. But when you have two cutoff points, the movement in and out of it may have different meanings. This is mobility into and out of middle class status that we constructed using the synthetic panel data created out of the 42 by about for 86 waves. So anyway, what you see is for all cohorts, the transition before and after the 2000 is a bit interesting. One is the average size of the middle class, whichever way you look at it in Africa, is quite low. It's about 9%. And the poor is about at 6%, the size of the asset pool. So still there is a long way to go for the continent, despite the fact that we are saying the middle class is rising. The level from which we come from is still staggering. Then when you look at the transition across these classes by education, what emerges is quite interesting. Education becomes very important. The same thing for primary, secondary. The more you take that into account, the better it becomes for educated ones. This is tertiary. Okay, this is what I tried to look at from real panel. This is from Ethiopia, which we have been collecting for the last 10 years. Between 1994 and 2004, people were asked to just put themselves into different classes. Are you rich, middle class, and poor? This is subjective assessment. We don't do any asset index, etc. Okay, so I may have to go very fast to, because the interesting things are a bit in the last slides. One is the cross-country correlates of size of middle class. Ethnicity, the way it has been measured in the data set, which all of us use, fractionalization, does seem in all of the regressions we have included in the paper to show up as a negative force affecting the size of the middle class, whichever way you look at it. Panel data sets, cross-country, etc. Initial conditions, the differences in per capita GDP in the earlies affect also the path of the formation of the middle class. So let me just highlight a few slides from some of the regressions we did. As I said earlier, one area where we focused is governance or institutions. When we tried to correlate the governance index with a host of other factors, including education, health, etc., it turns out that governance still plays a major role in the making of the middle class. And another interesting variable we used is social capital, trust. From the international value surveys, I just picked, the trust data set and put it in this. And it turned out that societies with a much better trust level have a better size of middle class. When you do it even in a panel data context, when you control all those individual country-specific effects. This is the last slide. What we've done is run simple mean-Syrian type regressions on asset index for about 82 DHS datasets, and then use these coefficients whether they make some sense or not. Two findings that are interesting. One, in about more than 30% of cases, the variation in the asset index accounted by education exceeding 25%, in about 30 countries, the role of education in explaining the asset index more than 25%. So that is simply to say education has a strong role. I mean, we controlled for country by country and wave by wave, and we did a lot of these regions, ethnicity, household size, occupation, all kinds of controls. So education seems to be a very strong predictor of being in a middle class. Now the question is, suppose governments pump money to raise the level of education, how does it work? I think this is the answer this slide tries to answer, is that especially for primary and tertiary and secondary levels, the returns to education declines systematically with the stock of education you have. So probably one of the message from this is it's not only supply of education that matters, but also the demand side, which means people who get education need to be employed. I mean, this is what we see, for instance, in North Africa. Education level is very well done. There is no issue with the government for not providing education. The issue is for providing employment, meaningful employment. So this is the context in which we try to understand this one. And the final slide is, again, ethnicities. I looked at the rate of growth in the size of, in the asset index. Still, the role of initial conditions seem to be very, very strong. So this is the conclusion. Middle class is rising in Africa, and the probability of maintaining a middle class status is also fairly high. Once you are in the middle class status, the chance you are slipping back is very, very small. Of course, ethnicity and all these trust and social issues matter. Thank you for your hearing.
So thank you, Abebe. It's a really nice paper. I'm really glad to have read it. It's very ambitious. You collect, or you use DHS data from a large set of countries, and you try to create one index for the whole of Africa on what on wealth, and I think it's ambitious and very good. I also think it's good that you focus on the middle class. I think class analysis is something that economists rarely do, even though it's very, very important. But I think that you should discuss the class issues more, what we mean by middle class. You say that there are a lot of different definitions, but in the paper you do not really discuss them. For me, I think the most important definitions of middle class are the Weberian ones, where you have, basically you should have some people below you and some people above you, right? And in your paper, that's usually not the case in most of the countries that you actually end up showing. And you motivate that you want to look at the middle class because the middle class has some virtues in that they are politically active, they promote democracy, social mobility and so forth. But in many of your countries that you actually, since you use an African average, in many of your countries that you actually look at, what you define as the middle class is either the lower class, as in Egypt, as you can see on the slides, or an extreme upper class, as in Madagascar. We don't really think that those groups should lead to more social mobility or strive for democracy and so forth. So I would suggest combining your measure with a relative measure within countries as well. Because I really like the idea that the middle class is not only where the mean of the distribution is and only around that. It should be some kind of absolute level of resources as well. But I think that only looking at the absolute level of resources is not sufficient either, because your relative position in society is also important. So what I would do is to use your measure, but in addition, calculate the number of people around the mean, and say that, okay, those are, if they are above this threshold, this critical threshold, they belong to the middle class. I think that would be a much better measure. It would show that the middle class has increased even less than usual, but I think it's a more plausible measure in terms of understanding the middle class and the relative definition of the middle class. So that's basically my main point, and I think it's also clear when you combine it with when you look at your Ethiopian data, where you see that about 44% argue that they are in the middle class. If you ask them, they say themselves that they are in the middle class. And I think that's an important aspect of the middle class, right? Because you get a sense of belonging, you get a sense of that you are in the middle, perhaps you have some influence and stuff like that. And in your data, it's 9% in the DHS data. So I think there's probably a mismatch there. I would also want to know, because you use the wealth data from the DHS and you create your own index, right? The DHS create their own index as well. I would like to know what's better with your index than their index. I would like to know. And I would also like some description about what the typical middle class person in your data is. Owns a car, what else? A typical person. Thank you. I have some more. We can take it after.
Okay. Do you want
Please
to? Yeah. Thanks very much. I think what you have raised is essentially more defining the middle class. Who are they, or how do we understand them? And I wish, the data is so easy to pick, for instance, your favorite middle class. In this context, for instance, what I've done, or in the paper, what we have tried to do is, there is a median asset index, and then 120%, anyone above 25% on this side, and then less than 25% on this. It's arbitrary. And even the index is unit-free. There is nothing in it that is qualitatively meaningful when you combine more than 11, 12 different asset index. Is it people who own a car? Is it people who live in a nice... I think that distinction will be lost in the aggregation that we do. So I don't think I will be able to succeed in that context. Probably what may be interesting is the factors that drive howsoever you define your middle class, because that definition is held constant across countries and across time. Otherwise, there is no point in making the comparison. One needs to just hold on to one country, for instance. That means country by country. But if I'm trying to compare people in Madagascar with people in Egypt, my index needs to be transferable to those countries. That means if I take an Egyptian to Madagascar and a guy from Madagascar to Egypt, his class should not change. I mean, this is the basic premise in the absolute measure that we are taking. But I think I agree on one thing. We need to do robust, different ways of measuring the middle class and see if what I have here in the correlations make a lot of sense. But I think That's important. But the case in Ethiopia, for instance, the self-reported middle class size and the one we get from the DHS, I think, you know, I don't, when you look at the transition metrics, actually what struck me was the similarity with the overall picture we got. About 70% people who were in middle class in the 1990s still remained in the middle class. The same thing in Ethiopia. Those who considered themselves middle class in 94 remained in the same category for after 10 years. And a few actually transited into the upper class, etc. But let's hear from others. But I think you have very good points.
We have some other questions.
Okay, I have to stay here. Yeah.
Yeah, should I do it with? Christian Meyer with the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. I work with Nancy Birdsall, who's done a lot of research on that, and we're very happy that you're also doing this kind of research for Africa. I think this is a very exciting paper. I'm very interested about hearing your findings. I'm very glad to see that you're taking up this definition of 0.5 to 0.775, which mirrors, I think, a Birdsall-Graham paper from 2004. I am also very glad to see these correlations that you have at the back of the paper. I think some of these findings are very similar to ours, and I think the World Value Survey trust correlation is very interesting. We've recently been playing exactly with these World Value Surveys, and we find very similar things. I think Hassan made a very good point about the typical person. I think it's helpful for the reader if you had sort of a little section about who this middle class person in Africa is, because it's hard to figure out from the asset index for me. But going forward, I had a couple of thoughts. One thing would be the interpretation of the asset index could also be helped maybe if you constructed some measure of permanent income. There's some work on Latin America that we've been involved with, especially the work of Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and Eduardo Ortiz at the World Bank, who have used a similar kind of approach to the panel and who've constructed sort of a permanent measure of income and then linked transitions into and out of the middle class with a certain level of absolute PPP income, which I think is very helpful for the reader. Which is also linked to my next point. Seeing these transition matrices, I thought it would be very interesting to see a probability attached to that. You could run a simple probit model looking at your index components and looking at what sort of the probability of dropping out of the middle class is based on these components. And then you could even attach sort of an income to that, which is what they did. So I think you have a great start, and I think there's a couple of very interesting avenues that you could pursue. So thank you very much.
Would you like to answer these questions? We have just 2 minutes for this one. So please answer quickly, and then if you have 1 minute, we can take another question.
I think the comments are very good. It's going forward, so I like you like it.
Thanks very much. I'll be quick. 2 reflections. One is, to what extent do your results, I'm going to put it provocative, just reflect a lack of urbanization? So that's for me a missing variable. I would be really excited to see, because we know, okay, there's some metropolitan areas, there's small towns, but there is a missing middle, especially for Africa. And so that would be interesting to see. And it's relevant especially for your policy recommendations. There's a literature suggesting that urbanization is the way forward. And then the second thing is more of we can talk about it afterwards, but I'm sure you've thought about this ethnic fractionalization. So what is your guess? What are we measuring? Is it willingness to contribute to a public good? Is it transaction cost that leads to limited market integration? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, Peter, I think these are very good points. Even as I was trying to update this paper, urbanization was something in my mind. Absolutely, you are right. I mean, anywhere in Africa, this concentration of people with some good means are found oftentimes in fixed localities such as urban enclaves. In the individual regressions, we included the urban dummy in the just to see, and it has a strong role, obviously. But to put it in the cross-country one, it would be, it might be surprising. I think the ethnicity. I didn't want to push the paper to be more than it is in just to say, okay, ethnicity matters. But then if you go into deeper, in some places, people are sensitive about this. So what? Everyone says, if we are ethnically divided, what does it mean? But I think my understanding of the continent is that on the average, it's not everywhere, but on the average, it puts barrier across social mobility. If you interacted with institutions, which I did in the paper, you find it's a very good instrument for governance. That means I put part of governance explained by ethnic, what you call it, ethnic fractionalization, not as such because it's a cause. It's simply making it harder for governments and for the political system to accommodate that. Some countries do very well because of ethnicity. India, for instance, is a country that has, Ethiopia has 80 ethnic groups, but it's doing well in some sense. So there are a lot of holes in the concept, but I can't help it in the regression. It just keeps on coming. It just doesn't go away. So definitely it's worth making some speculation in finalizing the paper.
Thank you.
Well done.
So I think mine, I don't know, it was here before.
Which one is violence? Would you mind?
Yeah, put it in there.
Which one? Violence, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So now my slides are back. So I'm Andreas Gottsaren, and I'm going to talk about violence against women in sub-Saharan Africa. And I probably shouldn't move that much, because that will be bad for you, so I will try to stay still. This is co-work with Sarah Kohls, who is at Norwegian Business School. And the motivation is basically that domestic violence is very prevalent in the region that we're looking at. And it's prevalent in all societies, but it's also prevalent to different degrees in different societies. And it's also different trends over time in domestic violence. Of course, it entails a lot of large costs in terms of utility of the women that are victims of domestic violence. Also in terms of health costs and productivity, shame and fear. And behind every battered woman, there are also other women that live in fear of being exposed to domestic violence, and there are also other family members that suffer, in particular children. And this is just to show you that the perceptions of domestic violence differ a lot across the world. You probably don't see it that well there, but And here it shows that among the 15 countries where the domestic violence is mostly accepted, 14 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the acceptance of domestic violence in the region we're looking at is high. So what do we do then? Well, we connect microdata for over 500,000 women and almost 200,000 men. And we want to examine the variation in acceptance and also actual wife beating across time and across space. We want to explore explanations at both the individual level and at the contextual level. And we also explore some specific hypotheses regarding conflict, religion, education, using spatial data, historical exposure, and some educational reforms. So these are the results, in case I want to get there. I have a lot of slides. Female employment at the individual level, as well as at the societal level, is associated with more wife beating, not less. So is living in a community with more wealth inequality. Individual attitudes towards beating seem to be really important. They're really good at predicting whether you have been beaten or not, and also living in an area, either a cluster or a region, where there is more social acceptability of wife beating. It's a great risk factor of having been beaten yourself. We find no heightened risk of exposure to wife beating during conflicts. And we find that having more education or a partner with more education is correlated with less risk, but we find no effects when we use these experiments or national experiments using the reform. On the other hand, we cannot reject that the effects are large either. They could be all over the place, basically, which is boring. So this is the outline, since I got 15 minutes. So I'm going to talk about the previous literature, then data, results, and then I'm going to look into these more hypotheses where we actually have better data as well. So there are many different explanations for why men abuse their partners. In evolutionary psychology and radical feminists, they usually focus on the issue that men want to control women's sexuality in some sense. We do not focus on those explanations here because we know that there is a lot of variation across time and space. So while these explanations may explain or may not explain part of why men beat women, they are unlikely to explain why there is such large variation over place. So we focus on resources, religion, inequality, and conflict. And resources are argued to be very important, but the predictions are actually quite unclear. And with resources, we mean wealth, employment, education, etc. And that they are believed to lead to more autonomy for women, and autonomy is argued to reduce violence. But on the other hand, it may also be the case that increased resources lead to a backlash. And there are basically two strands of literature arguing for these kinds of effects. One is an identity literature, mainly from sociology, arguing that the context in where most men and women live is one of where you should have a male breadwinner and the woman should be home. And then if the woman gets work and the man is unemployed, that should be really important and dangerous in terms of threatening male identity. But also from an economic point of view, there are models arguing that when women get work, they do indeed get more bargaining power. But in order for the man to retain the bargaining power within the household, he may use violence. Religion is another one that is also very common as a predictor of domestic violence. And we know that religious tradition shapes attitude, both at the individual level, but also living in a more or less religious society shapes your attitudes. And it has been particularly argued that Islam is important here. Pippa Norris has a series of papers on that, and that's also quite contested. And we actually find the opposite. And also with respect to Christianity, there seems to be a difference between living in a Protestant or a Catholic community. Inequality has also been argued to be important, both across household and also between men and women, when we look at that. Conflict has been important. It's not only the case that it has been used as a military strategy, but it's also argued that it creates a kind of hypermasculinity or a type of armed masculinity that leads to generalized violence against women, so that violence in the household is also argued to increase during conflicts. So we use demographic and health surveys, and they have data on both attitudes and actual violence. And these are our clusters that we use, and there are about 540,000 observations for attitudes towards wife beating, and they are from 1992 to 2011. And the main measure of attitudes towards wife beatings are this, that all the respondents are asked if a husband is justified in beating his wife in one of these conditions. And the people think this one is most acceptable to beat the wife, and this one is less acceptable to beat the wife. But we create a measure which is basically 1 if you think that any of these reasons is acceptable, makes it acceptable to beat the wife, and over 55% of the women in our samples think so. We also create a measure of the number of statements that the respondent agrees with, and on average that's 1.6. So here's the distribution across country. We see that, for instance, in Mali, the rate is over 82% that think that it's okay to beat the wife. And then we also look at actual wife beating. And it's only women who are asked, and we have less observations. And it's a good data, specifically trained staff, which is good. So, and it's a strict protocol to ensure privacy. And we create a measure of physical violence if you have ever been exposed to physical violence, and also if you have been so the last year. And here we see the variation over space, and here we see Mali again has actually a low level of actual violence, but otherwise the correlations are quite high between attitudes. So we have some basic regressions with year and region fixed effects and region-specific time trends and so on. And we see that living in an urban area is correlated with less acceptance of wife beating. Older people are more acceptant of wife beating, but at a diminishing rate. Working is not, as people usually consider, correlated with thinking that wife beating is less okay, but other way around. Education seems to be good in that sense. Number of children, bad. Being richer is correlated with less acceptance of wife beating, and being a Muslim is correlated with more. But here are actual violence, and there we see that living in an urban area seems to be more correlated with actual violence. Could be a reporting issue, we discussed that as well. Also working is problematic in this sense, as working women are more exposed to physical violence. Schooling seems to be good. Living in a Muslim society or being Muslim is correlated with less actual violence. There's a clear non-linear relationship with education in terms of physical violence. So the blue bars are attitudes towards violence and seem to decrease with education. But actual physical violence is a clear inverted U shape. And that's been found in the US as well. It's been found for several decades ago in the US and today in the US. And one explanation may be that, well, you get a little bit more education, so you maybe oppose norms, but then you actually get more beaten since you do not have enough education to actually resist being beaten. Household wealth is only correlated with attitudes. With respect to actual beating, the relationship is actually flat. We also aggregate our variables because we want to see the contextual level influence on actual wife beating and also on attitudes. So the cluster level, that is the actual village where people live, seems to be more important than the regional level, which is probably what you expect. We find that having more women working in a cluster, again, is correlated with more violence, and so is living in a cluster with more Christians, but not living in a cluster with more Muslims. So again, also living in an area which is more wealth unequal is strongly correlated with more violence. And actual violence is really correlated with attitudes, as I said before. So we look closer at Christianity. That basically we look under the lamp because we have some data on missionary stations. So we use those, as none has done before. In particular, we have data on all Catholic and Protestant missions from 1924. And basically, we look at the area around that missions, and if people live there, they are more likely to be Protestants or Catholics. And we use it first in a reduced form, and we see that, well, living close to any type of mission is actually correlated with being more exposed to violence. And we also believe that the link is via Christianity. So we do an instrumental variables approach, and we find that Christianity with these instruments is strongly correlated with the risk of being beaten. But we did not give it a causal interpretation because missionary stations were not allocated randomly. And there are lots of stuff we should control for here, but which we do not have data for yet. We also look at conflicts. We take the Uppsala data on conflicts, which is good because then we actually have the actual regions of the conflicts, and we connect that to our DHS clusters, and we also know the timing of the conflicts. So this we have for conflicts starting from 1989, and from that we have the number of deaths of each conflict and so on. So what is the relationship between being in a conflict and a wife beating at home. Basically, no relationship. So 0 here is the actual time of the conflict. That's when it is a conflict. If the theories were correct that there is a spike of wife beating during conflicts, we should see a spike here. We do not. So minus are before the conflicts and afterwards are plus. So nothing there. We also look at education, since we follow Fenske, basically, who exploits a number of educational experiments. We exploit the same educational experiments. We exploit primary school expansion in Nigeria and in Zimbabwe. We also look at the Kenyan expansion of primary school with 1 year to look at the causal effects of education. And we find no effects of violence using these reforms, but neither can we reject quite large effects either. So that's basically it. So to summarize, wife beating is widely accepted in the region that we look at, and the levels of exposure are really high. Female employment is associated with more violence, and so is living in places where more women work. Being Muslim or being in a Muslim community is correlated with less risk of wife beating, in contrast to previous literature. Christianity seems correlated with less acceptance, but more actual wife beating. Living in a more wealth unequal society, be it the actual village you live in or the region you live in, is strongly correlated with being exposed to actual violence. Attitudes are a really important predictor, both at the individual and at the contextual level. We find no heightened risk of exposure to domestic violence during conflicts, but we will of course work a lot more there. Could be other channels, could be that you are exposed to violence when you're in a particular age, that may lead to more wife beating later on, and so on. So we will look more at that. We do not find anything when we use educational reforms, but when we look at the correlations, there's really large correlations between education or partners' education as well and violence. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Andreas. I have to say that I don't have so much time to discuss the details, so what I'm going to say is I'm going to give you some basic kind of reflections I had on the paper. First of all, I think the good thing about the paper is that it actually brings together a set of different data sets that are relevant for this kind of question, and I'm actually convinced that some of the measures that you use are better for some particular attitudinal kind of questions and some other factors that affect violence. This is the advantage of the paper. However, I think that one particularly confusing thing is that, again, that's my personal view, is that it tries to deal with many different questions in one piece. So you have also a descriptive, quite an analytical, descriptive and extensive descriptive work trying to identify the correlates of violence across a wide range of factors, which makes the whole exercise very interesting. But at the same time, in the same paper, you try to identify causal effects of 3 different things: education, conflict, religion. I mean, there are many people that believe that they can write this paper, and I'm not against it, but the limitation of length does not give you the right to actually make a right kind of analogy of the causality, because when you write a causal paper, then you have to actually make tests, robustness, and validate, discuss the validity of their instruments, etc. So I don't think there is too much length to actually tackle all these questions convincingly in one paper. Now, so I will focus mainly on the descriptive piece of the paper. A basic comment is about the motivation. I'm sure and I'm convinced that the phenomenon is prevalent, especially in these regions, and also that has enormous implications for growth, for individual development, behavior, etc. But I haven't seen any discussion of existing literature, in a sense that what other people have found on the evidence about what drives violence and reporting violence and accepting violence. So what is new about your patterns in terms of your descriptive work? And so this should be emphasized, like to place your work within the existing literature and actually highlight your originality. Now, I think that one important factor that should be always taken into account in this particular attitudinal kind of questions is ethnicity. And I'm not sure whether it was included. Really, you actually take into account seriously religion, but I think that there is ethnic variation within countries that it of course tries to picks up cultural kind of attitudes, differences, etc. Finally, I think that there are some effects or results that should be reconciled. For example, let me give you an example among the many, is that it is, you find that is, I mean, one of the results says that it is less acceptable by urban men to beat their wife, but urban women are more likely to report physical violence. There are several bits and pieces there, and I think one slight first kind of intuition is that this may be actually because of the fact of the difference between actual violence occurring and reporting a violent act, because it's about how you perceive. Some women may perceive the same act to be violent, some other actually women not to be. And the same. So at the end of the day, you have to try to reconcile with interpretations and discussion the difference between attitudes that are actually characteristics that actually are negatively correlated with accepting violence, and the same characteristics being actually positively correlated, or in the other way around, with actual reporting of violence. The same is between reconciling results of specification that you include individual characteristics and fixed effects, and specification where you include individual characteristics and contextual variables. So there are, if you compare some of the results there you have also some kind of association that should be reconciled. An example is that in the one example where you have individual characteristics and fixed effects, not contextual variables, you have working women less likely to find acceptable to beat a wife, but when you actually go to specification where you exclude the fixed effects but you include contextual variables, you find that they find more acceptable. I'm done.
You have a question? Would you like to respond first?
I respond to this while I remember. There are really very, very good comments there. This is really preliminary work, and you will hate the paper even more once we're finished, because we want to put more stuff here, right? So basically the idea is economists usually focus on one thing and don't really care about the R squared. We don't really want to explain the variation in something. We want to say that, well, this is causally related to this. What we try to do in this paper is to combine both. We both want to try to explain the variation in violence against women, because we think that is important on its own, and we also don't want to give up on causal analysis, so we do some causal analysis as well, and we will include more stuff there as well. Maybe it will become too long, and maybe it will become a project instead of a single paper. I don't know, but that's yes. And yeah, too little literature review in the paper. Definitely, it should be there. We should write that up. And the ethnicity is, of course, very important. We're trying to we are in the process of coding the ethnic groups in all data sets as well. The reporting issues are really important. I think that this is probably one of the best data sets when it comes to dealing with under-reporting, because it really uses specifically trained staff. It really uses that the woman should be alone. There should be no one within hearing distance. They actually terminated the interviews if not, and so on. But still, of course, the reporting may be correlated with other factors that we are interested in. If you are more highly educated, you probably know that it's not socially acceptable to say that you have been beaten and so on. So that's definitely problematic, and I don't really know how we should get on with that. But what we can say is that, well, in this region there is really a social acceptability of beating women, which should lead to less underreporting. And the fact that we find that more than 33% of the women actually report having been beaten should say that, well, it's not so dangerous, at least. And yeah, I'll take more questions and come back if I have time.
I'm Anke Höfler. Thank you for an interesting presentation. If I've got you right, then Muslims and Muslim clusters experience less wife beating. And I was wondering whether this is really a religious phenomenon. So does this religion tame these Muslim men? Or are there different norms and social controls in these sort of societies when you live close to maybe your own birth family as a wife? And are there sort of maybe through Sharia law ways of disciplining your men, and do they know that? So is it more social control? And then slightly related with this, is it question of polygamy? I know that that isn't necessarily only Muslim, but there's obviously an overlap. So does it happen more in polygamous households or less?
I just have two questions. Regarding the impact of conflict, I was wondering whether you were looking only at contemporaneous relationship, in the sense that sometimes in the literature on conflict you would find some link to domestic violence, but in post-conflict situation, like I don't know, you call that mental disorder or something. And also, just given the talk we had yesterday about climate, did you think about introducing temperature variation? And at least for this, you may think it's highly exogenous. And maybe lastly, I'd like to know a little bit about the use of fixed effect, because basically with the fixed effect, of course, it's very nice for unobserved heterogeneity, but you increase quite a lot the issue of simultaneity too, right? For example, with the variable working. So I was wondering whether you can give us some thought about it.
Would you like to answer to this?
I can take some more actually.
Okay, let's do two more.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you are looking also at the determinants of wife beating acceptance from the women themselves, because I think this is extremely important. It has an impact on whether they report beating, and even if you put a type of policy in place. I remember when I arrived in Canada, it was really interesting to see the 911 you can call for women. That doesn't exist in my country. So even if you put that type of policy in place, maybe they won't use it if they think that it's acceptable. So the determinants of acceptance by women themselves might be also something important to look at.
Okay, so I have one question related to the effectiveness of the judiciary system, especially when it comes to how the law, or maybe I would say the government is protecting women rights in the country. And the other one is, I don't know whether you have data on, not just the frequency, not the frequency, I would say the occurrence or the incidence of violence, but also the severity of violence, and also how frequent that violence generally occurs. And as a Muslim, I would say one of the good news of the paper is that the finding that Islam is less associated with violence against women. This is generally contradictory, opposite to the many stereotypes we have about Islam, which generally says Islam is more prone to violence to women. But as a Muslim, I would say your finding is directly in line with Islamic teaching.
We have 2 more minutes to...
I prefer to take questions, but I'm not known. But please afterwards. Yeah, I can answer some of them quickly. Well, about Islam, I think that several of you raised that. I think it's important that we find and document that the correlation is actually the opposite way from what other people have found. We actually have a paper also with some other co-authors who are here on political participation. We basically find the same thing there, that it's actually more female, less gender bias in political participation in more Muslim communities. So I think that's important to put out there as well. But then, of course, it is of course correlated with a lot of other stuff, right? So we use region fixed effects to try to, which was another question here, to try to just look within the region. And we're also going to do the same thing as we do with the old missionary stations. We're going to look at old Muslim trade routes and see, okay, if you live closer to old Muslim trade routes, you're more likely to be Muslim today. And is that also correlated with less wife beating and so on? Post-conflict, yes, of course. We actually see no relationship at all with conflicts. Even we see that there are some spikes, like 3 to 6 years afterwards, but they go like in both directions. So, but we will definitely do a lot more. We'll also look at the intensity of conflicts and different types of conflicts. We have just done this basic stuff so far. Climate, rainfall, yes, that will be in the extended version of the paper, definitely. So now I can perhaps take more questions.
Okay, one more question, Paula. Let's keep it short. If you could keep the question very short.
In your introductory remarks, you referred to the secondary effects of violence on children, but you didn't elaborate on it. Since you're using DHS data, it seems to me that you could very usefully go on. There's a lot of good micro-level studies that show the nutritional trajectories are strongly affected by domestic violence, and it'd be interesting to see some empirical results on that.
Thank you.
I just had a question. You mentioned that you have run multi-level regressions using cluster, and then you mentioned you used the jackknife procedure. Was that accurate? I mean, did I get it right? You said you used jackknife.
Yeah.
So why jackknife and not bootstrap?
Well, basically we use jackknife when we include the contextual level variables. Basically, what we do is that we take away each individual so that they're not in the average. In the multi-level regressions, we do not use jackknife method. I think what we have done is in the multi-level regressions is only to see at what level is the variation mostly explained. So we don't really do that much of the multi-level. We see that most of the variation is explained at the cluster level, for instance, and that's an important factor with that. But in the main part of the analysis, we do not use multi-level regressions yet, but we probably will. Yeah, very good point with nutrition. That is probably one thing that will, if I do it, will be in another paper. But it's definitely important. I also want to talk about this with polygamy. It's probably also really important to control for, and also look at the variation and see if polygamy is a risk factor. It probably is. So I'm satisfied. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, the first three presentations were more empirical in nature. This has an empirical example, but it's a bit more technical as we will go in understanding when to use a particular measure, and we have to be careful using any measure to understand the phenomena. So there's been a recent development in multidimensional poverty measurement over the past few decades, and recently the UNDP has also adopted the multidimensional poverty index, which is an adaptation from one index proposed by Sabine Alkire and James Foster. So there are two different types of approaches to poverty measurement. One is based on the direct extension of the income poverty ideas, which assumes the dimensions. We have continuous variables for each dimension, and the poverty measure is constructed based on that. And second kind of approaches are based on binary data or categorical data, which assumes that for each dimension or indicator, we are able to identify if someone is deprived or not deprived in a particular indicator, and then use those information to construct a poverty measure. The measure adapted by the UNDP, called Multidimensional Poverty Index, is based on the binary data counting approaches. Now, the way the MPI was constructed, it did not capture inequality across groups or inequality across people, which has been customary since seminal article in Econometrica, where Sen mentioned that understanding inequality across the poor is crucial. And of course, Jenkins and Lambert has discussed the 3 I's of poverty: its incidence, its intensity, and also its inequality. Now, consideration of inequality is very natural when we have cardinal measures, because we have continuous variables, and they can be used to understand inequality within each indicator. But when we have binary indicators for counting approaches, it becomes difficult to understand inequality within each indicator. However, what we can do is try to understand inequality across the joint deprivations. So it is possible, for example, for multidimensional poverty index, they have 10 indicators. So it is possible that a person or a household is deprived in all 10 indicators, and then there is a household which is deprived maybe in 3 out of 10 indicators. And there, the extent of their multiple deprivations or joint deprivations is not exactly the same, which can be accounted by a deprivation score vector, which gives the extent of deprivations of each individual. Now, the common response has been to build in an inequality index within a poverty measure. So that means to make the poverty index sensitive to inequality. So if we have change in inequality among the poor, it is identified inside the poverty index. Bossert Chakraborty and D'Ambrosio has done that. Jairaj Subramaniam and recently Nicole Rippin has proposed a similar kind of index. And the second kind of indices, they are just extension of the famous Foster-Greer-Thorbecke index, which squares the deprivations up and then take an average. Now, these indicators are suitable for ranking regions. However, it becomes a bit difficult when we are trying to understand between group inequality and within group inequality and try to decompose them. To remind you, it's inequality in poverty analysis. I'm not talking about inequality in welfare analysis per se here. So the first thing that we try to ask is what type of inequality should matter in a counting approach. In income approach, it is quite customary to say that if everybody's income is doubled or tripled or quadrupled in a society, inequality doesn't change. It has also a currency conversion argument that if a particular income is converted to a different currency, it should not show different level of inequality. And so a property called scale invariance is imposed. So if everybody's income is increased by 2 times, 3 times, or 4 times, inequality should not change. This is called a rightist viewpoint by Combe, who wrote a paper in 1976. And there's another argument which says that if everybody's income, I'm talking about the example in terms of income at this moment, is increased by the same amount, then the inequality should not change. And Combe called it a leftist view of inequality. So which one is appropriate in the framework that MPI or other multidimensional poverty indices based on binary indicators has been proposed? We consider an example. Suppose we have 2 deprivation vectors, and there are 2 persons who are not deprived in any indicator. And then in vector C1, suppose one person is deprived in 10% of indicators, another person is 30% of indicators. In another society, say, there are also 2 poor, but one is deprived in 40% of all indicators, so out of 10 indicators, and there is another person deprived in all 10 indicators. Now, if we ask, where do we have more inequality among the poor? Based on any relative inequality measure, then the answer would be C1 has more inequality, which may be a bit difficult to justify because we are talking about multiple deprivations. Each additional indicator or deprivation in each additional indicator may have intrinsic importance. Absolute inequality measure would say C2 has more inequality because the number of deprivations are far apart from each other. Here is an example from 2 Indian states, state A and state B, which gives the total population, total poor population. We identify anyone as poor who is deprived in at least one indicator. And it says there are in state A, 5.4 million people not deprived at all in an indicator, 24 million people deprived between 0 to 30% of indicators, and then similarly 3 million people between 30 to 60% and 0.2 million people between 60 and 80. And there is no severely poor. No one is deprived in 80 or 90 or between 90 and 100% of indicators. Whereas in state B, we have nearly more than 20 million people each in two categories, 0 to 30% deprived and 30% to 60% deprived. And there's a large number of people who are also deprived in nearly all indicators, 1 million of them. If we ask which state has more inequality across the poor, we find it hard to defend that state A has more inequality among the poor. However, if we use any usual inequality measures, such as generalized entropy or Gini coefficient, generalized entropy is the coefficient of variation square, they will result in state A having much larger inequality among the poor than state B. So, use of relative inequality measure, the traditional inequality measure that comes in our mind, which is Gini, which is coefficient of variation, may lead to or may not lead to a completely right policy implication in this case. In fact, state A is Kerala, state B is Rajasthan. This is our work based on demographic health survey dataset, where we try to compare multidimensional poverty in India between 1999 and 2006. So we argue that distance is more appropriate in the context of counting approaches rather than the scaling. Then we stand in a situation where we have two directions to go: create another poverty index, add another poverty index in the list of a number of indices that is sensitive to absolute inequality, or just to use a separate inequality measure to analyze inequality between group and inequality within group. We choose to go for B because it can be used to analyze inequality within group and between group. It is easier than just going beyond ranking. Then the question becomes, which inequality measure? By the way, I should also mention that our motivation for the between group, within group analysis also came from the literature on horizontal inequality, motivated by Professor Francis Stewart, who emphasized the need for understanding, not only understanding inequality among people, but also inequality among groups, which is a major reason of conflict. So we want this particular measure to satisfy some of the simple principles. One principle is what Chakrabarty called population share weighted decomposability, which means that when we are computing the total within group inequality, it should be expressed as the population share weighted inequality within each of the groups. It is helpful because if somebody wants to know what is the source of or which group is the major source of inequality, overall inequality, it is possible to understand that particular group's contribution to the overall within group inequality. And we just use the results from Chakrabarty, who shows that if you want these indices to satisfy some of these principles, then its equivalent of variance, a multiple, positive multiple of variance, is the only measure that satisfies all these principles. So we actually then propose that if we want these particular properties to be satisfied, this is the only inequality measure that we should use. We should not go for coefficient of variation or Gini coefficient. Then we try to calculate the inequality, and we find actually when we look at the differences, how far poor are from the mean value, then it shows that this particular measure is showing much larger inequality in state B than in state A. Now, the natural decomposition, let me show you an example that we apply across castes in India. When we, in our paper, other paper where we compare multidimensional poverty, change in multidimensional poverty between 1999 and 2006, we found that most of the poorest groups in India made least progress in terms of multidimensional poverty. which means the disparity across the groups increased in India. Although the overall multidimensional poverty fell between 1999 and 2006, disparity in that sense increased. So one of our interests then is to understand how the inequality has changed in India across caste. So if you see in the slide, the left side column, how to show it here? Here, this column shows the average deprivation scores of the poor, those who are poor. This shows the share, the distribution of poor across these 4 groups. And these are the inequality values. I have multiplied by 100 so that they reads well. And the scheduled tribes, these are scheduled tribes, had largest inequality among the poor. This is the overall inequality, and this shows the between group inequality among these intensities among the poor. If you want to understand the contribution, this graph quickly shows that the contribution of each group to this overall inequality, which shows that between group inequalities is actually very small. What happened over time? We present these slides and you can see that overall inequality has gone down. Total within group inequality, which is the sum or weighted average of these inequalities, it has also gone down, and the between group inequality has also fallen slightly. Of course, we need statistical tests to understand they are significant or not, but we haven't developed them yet. As you can see, if you zoom in among scheduled tribes, the situation of inequality among the poor has actually increased. It has not gone down. It has gone down among scheduled caste and other backward classes. And for general category as well, there is actually a huge movement of population between these 2 groups in India between 1999 and 2006. Many general category groups were awarded other backward classes status. As a result, there has been a huge shift of people between these 2 groups. If we look at the change in contributions, so even though the general category had increase in inequality, their contribution, here is the contribution. Their contribution fell mostly because of the population share. So if someone is interested to know what is the contribution of within group of a particular group's inequality to overall inequality, this is the way to judge. Then we stop and ask, is that enough? We mentioned about horizontal inequality. Horizontal inequality should look at whether the between group disparity in poverty has gone up or gone down. What we did until now just looked at within group inequality among the poor. Okay, we did not look at poverty across regions. We just looked at the situation among the poor, what has happened. Let's consider a simple example. For lack of space, I just wrote the number of indicators a particular person is deprived. Suppose we have a society of 10 individuals that we group in 5 and 5 in 2 groups. And over time, C becomes italicized C. So there has been a change in the number of deprivations, and indeed, poverty has improved in italicized C. If we look at groups, inequality between the poor, only inequality between the poor actually has gone down. So, one may conclude that originally inequality between the poor has gone down, inequality within each group has gone down, inequality between groups have gone down among the poor. But if you look at these 2 groups where we have 5 of them poor, here actually poverty fell, 2 of them poor, it's really difficult to argue that the poverty, disparity in poverty between 2 groups have gone down. Okay, so how we analyze inequality among the poor, it matters what we want to see. So, what we try to do, let me show you the next slide. Actually, let's flip this. When we try to find the between group disparity, this is the between group disparity only among the poor, and this is the disparity in poverty across groups. We find that between 1990 and 2006, the within group inequality only among the poor has actually gone down, whereas disparity in poverty actually has gone up. So one needs to look at disparity in poverty across regions, just not looking at disparity in poverty across the poor. Now, rest of the paper is still very much under progress. Comments are welcome. This is what we propose. Let me just show you. We try to learn from the existing indices of counting approaches. What they do, they use this entire deprivation score vector, which also attaches 0 to those who are not deprived in any indicator. This adjusted headcount ratio, which is behind the multidimensional poverty index of the United Nations, just takes an average of this entire deprivation vector. This is the MPI. It computes the deprivation profile of each individual and then just takes a simple average of that. Similarly, others have proposed to use the entire deprivation vector and then based on that proposed a multidimensional poverty index. So, instead of just looking at the variance only across the poor, this is what we propose to be reported along with the MPI values. So you compute the inequality across the deprivation score vector totally, which can actually be broken down into 3 different elements. The first element is inequality across the multidimensional poverty, across regions or across groups. The second one takes into account the overall within group inequality across groups. And this third particular term takes into account the inequality between the average deprivations among the poor from the ideal situation. The ideal situation would be no poverty or 0 deprivations among all. So that particular distance is captured by this particular index. And then we try to decompose, again, we apply our index based on the caste, across caste, and then we find that the share of the between group here for this particular index, the actual value remains same, but the share has actually gone up, which means that when the overall inequality has gone down, which is given by this value, 8.27 to 7.86. However, the between group, disparity in poverty between groups has not changed between these 2 years. So this is very much a work under progress. This is one sort of decompositions that we came up that can have policy implications. We are working through its application to other groups in India. That was just one application. So suggestions and comments are welcome. Stop here. No one followed me. I should have taken my phone. Sorry about that.
No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I think this is quite an interesting presentation. The paper is still in progress, as you've said. So I don't pretend I have understood everything you've said in this presentation. Actually, I stopped reading about poverty measurement when people start to talk about multidimensional poverty. I stopped it not out of anything, but simply I haven't done any much work on this topic for a long time. So what I can say is, from where I stopped, probably some insights that might help you. So a couple of comments and a question for you. One comment I have is, I think as you've said, the paper by Sen, which is the base of all this discussion, when he started out, he separated the measurement of poverty into three. How much poverty do we have in a society? Prevalence. And then how much is the average deprivation in the society? And then the third one is the relative deprivation, he says, compared to the other pools, which is essentially what you are talking about, inequality among the pool. And then he came up with his own one index. But then everyone started attacking that one index because it has to have a social welfare function and to meet all sorts of axioms, criterions. And one of it was that sense index, which is one index, gives you a very perverse result. That perverse result was, suppose you transfer income from the very poor person and give it to someone who is close to the poverty line. That means transfer of income from the poorest of the poor to the relatively poor person, the sense index will fall. Which means it's good to take away money from the very poor people and give it to another poor people so that he crosses the poverty line. So that was the attack on his index. And then for, I think, about 6-8 years, everyone was writing on alternative indices, which all of you have shown. And then the Foster, Greer, Torbeck came because their success was they separated everything. It's not in one index. So prevalence is in P1, is it? And then average deprivation is in, no, P0 is a head count, P1 is average deprivation, and P2 is the inequality among the poor. And honestly speaking, nobody, I mean, to this day, understood P2. P1, you can understand it. P1 means the average distance of the per capita income of the poor from the poverty line. That has a lot of meaning. Say, if a government wants to look at the burden of reducing poverty, that number tells you how much resources do you need to tackle it. Now, why I'm bringing this to you is, in the whole discussion, then the list of axioms came, you know, so the Foster, Greer, and Torbeck index, even in the multidimensional context, capture exactly what you're saying. So I would like really to know the variance decomposition you are proposing, how different it will be from the variance index of the Foster, Greer, Torbeck index. The other, I think, is it has nothing to do with this paper, but about just the multidimensional, you know, this counting the number of times a person is poor as part of capturing this multidimensional poverty, which is the count, the number of times a person is poor. To me, when you look at the distance from the number of counts I've been reading a bit after you sent me your presentation, and unfortunately I was unable to understand really what it means. I mean, conceptually for me, say, if I am poor in one dimension and non-poor in another dimension, does it mean there is a trade-off? That means an ISO poverty, for instance, for me, so that one day you can make me poor in one dimension and then make me less. This issue of substitution and complementarity, at the heart of the critics for this multidimensional poverty. What is the use of the practical significance of this type of index? That's my worry.
Thank you. Let me respond to you, and then, if time permits, I will go to the audience. First of all, SANE. SANE index had a problem initially when it Sen proposed the first time. It had been modified by Thon and Shorrock. afterwards, and they have solved that issue. So it's the modified version of SEN index is used. It does not have that problem that you mentioned. However, SEN index has one issue is that it is based on Gini coefficient. And Gini coefficient is not subgroup decomposable, subgroup consistent, which means if we divide the entire population into two groups, group A and group B, suppose inequality in group A does not change, inequality in group B increases, overall inequality can go down. So this is one problem of Gini coefficient or measures based on Gini coefficient that Foster, Greer, Thorbecke also criticized, and they introduced the concept of subgroup consistency, which a weaker version is subgroup decomposability. All decomposable measures are subgroup consistent. So the one that in the literature it has been shown that the Foster, Greer, Thorbecke, as you rightly mentioned, it has three different measures. P0 is the head count ratio, P1 looks at the average gap, and then P2, which looks at squared gap, which means the sensitive to inequality among the poor. It has been shown that it can be broken down into three I's of poverty, multiplicatively. Head count ratio multiplied by the gap, the average gap among the poor, times a term which is based on coefficient of variation. The coefficient of variation is actually standard deviation divided by the mean. So what I am proposing here is the variance, because when you are dividing by mean, you are essentially making the notion of inequality relative, which is very much ingrained in the idea of income inequality. Gini coefficient is a relative inequality measure. So that means if you increase everybody's income twice or thrice, Gini coefficient will say, no, inequality has not changed. Next, let me come to the idea of multidimensional poverty literature. Yes, in multidimensional poverty literature, when it was proposed by Gurjani and Chakrabarty in 2003, they discussed the idea of substitutability and complementarity between dimensions. The idea between counting approach is much more simple. What it is saying, it's saying it's important to look at the joint deprivations, the multiple deprivations, because multiple deprivations are important. If someone is deprived in 9 out of 10 indicators versus someone is deprived, say 1 out of or 2 out of 10 indicators, there is a difference, and that difference needs to be captured. So based on that, the counting approaches has been developed. Technically now, counting approaches, which is based on mostly the binary indicators that are available, because what you did, you constructed a well score. A well score, what it does, based on a well score, what you can only do, you can divide by quintiles or median or around median. You cannot set a particular poverty cutoff. It's very difficult in a wealth index. Okay? So based on that, instead of going to the wealth index and trying to gather all this information and then use a technique of multiple correspondence analysis, which may change from dataset to dataset or time to time, it is difficult to compare. Counting approaches, on the other hand, looks at joint distributions or the direct deprivations, where you are deprived in a particular period, in which indicators and how they are changing over time. Because in most of the developing countries, look at South Asia, look at Africa, what we have to deal with at first, the basic deprivations, lack of sanitation, lack of electricity, lack of many other different aspects. So the counting approaches just try to understand or reflect that joint distribution. Now when you are taking the average, then people has always complained, we don't know about the severity, how unequal they are. This is where the idea of inequality comes into play. It is very much ingrained in poverty measures that you also need to understand, because each of these indices, head count, poverty gap, they can influence policy. Head count measures, if that is the one that governments are following, they will allow only to help to those who are marginally poor and forget about those who are deeply deprived, because a government won't gain, a policymaker won't gain anything helping those people. Poverty gap can also lead to different kind of policy. Unless you take into account the inequality, then only it is possible to help the poorest of the poor. This is the idea behind the understanding of inequality in poverty.
So,
we are out of time, so if somebody has to go, I cannot force them to be here, but I am happy to continue conversations if you have questions. Sorry. And thank you so much.
no, you are doing very well.